We have had the pleasure and honor to welcome the Secretary General of the United Nations, António Guterres, for all the past editions of the Paris Peace Forum. Although I must admit, this year your presence is of extreme more importance than it's been in the past, I would say. Paris Peace Forum has worked since its inception to promote good global governance. What do we mean by that? By investing in resilience of multilateral institutions, of global cooperation, and critically platforming and promoting the projects, the on-ground work that is happening on a national, global, international level through the community of Paris Peace Forum. This year, as we prepare for the next edition of the forum, we will be focusing on preserving global cooperation in times of war, in the context of war that is happening in Ukraine. So we're looking forward to hearing your take, Secretary General, on this topic as the main stakeholder that everyone is looking to for some sort of direction and hope. So I know you don't like wasting a lot of time with pleasantries, so I will get right to it. You have repeatedly cited the sanctity of the UN Charter and international law to underscore why the UN recognizes what's happening in Ukraine as an invasion of sovereign territory. It was a specifically strong moment when you said the exact same words when you were facing President Putin as well, and not regarded it as a special military operation by Russia. How do we fortify trust in entities such as the UN, principle of common goods, during these times of war? And I'm asking you this knowing that currently there are people in Ukraine who would be listening to your words right now.
Well, first of all, we were clear in our position. This was a violation, as you mentioned, of international law, of the UN Charter. It was an invasion of a country by another, and the second, of course, being a permanent member of the Security Council, which made the Security Council totally unable to take any meaningful position because obviously permanent members, as you know, have the right to veto. So our position is clear. Now, what can we do in the Secretariat of the UN? It is obvious that at the present moment there are no peace negotiations taking part, and the UN was never asked to have a direct action in relation to those peace negotiations. We were not part of the Minsk agreement, we were not part of the Normandy format. So we have been, of course, asking for the war to end, we have been asking for ceasefires, but where we believe we have a contribution to give is essentially on the humanitarian dimension and is essentially on reducing the impacts of this war in relation to the global crisis that it is triggering, namely in relation to food, energy, and finance. So my first objective was to make the corridors for evacuation of civilians work, and simultaneously for aid to be distributed work. There was one dramatic situation that was blocked for months, and that situation was Azovstal. And my main objective when visiting Russia was to unblock that and to create conditions for the UN, together with the ICRC, and of course cooperating with the Russian and the Ukrainian authorities, to unblock that situation. And that was successfully done. It was complex, it was difficult, it had many obstacles, but it was done. And on the other hand, I've been doing everything I can and engaging directly with the parties. We created with our global response group task teams that are technically prepared in order to have a package deal. We would like to have a package deal allowing Ukrainian foodstuffs to be exported through the Black Sea, which means ending a situation in which Ukraine is not able to export its grain and other products, with dramatic consequences in the global markets, but also with dramatic consequences for the Ukraine, because the next harvest is coming and the silos are full. And at the same time, to unblock the ban of the Russian Federation for the exports of food and fertilizers that are absolutely needed in the international market, and to discuss with the US and the EU there are no restrictions, there are no sanctions on food and fertilizers, but there are a number of questions that need to be solved in order for those exports of food and fertilizers to be able to overcome the problems of shipping, of insurance, of payments, etc. So we need a package deal to put those two productions, the production of food by the Ukraine, the production of food and fertilizers by Russia, available to international markets, to end this dramatic situation in which the increase of food prices and the increase of energy prices is putting many developing countries in the risk of collapse. This crisis comes on top of another group of crises. We had the COVID, and we had vaccines unfairly distribution, and we have resources for recovery unfairly distribution. Developed countries had trillions to reanimate their economies. Developing countries had much less resources, and many of them are on the verge of a debt default or have no fiscal space. So we need at the same time to make sure that we are able to do everything we can to have a positive influence in the food market, in the energy market, to end all kinds of restrictions and boycotts that exist by some countries in relation to their exports and other kinds of things. And at the same time, we need to address the dramatic debt and liquidity problems of developing countries. So all these are actions that the UN can do. First of all, we fight for peace, we fight for peace, for ceasefires, we fight for the end of the war. This invasion must end. Troops must go back to the barracks. But at the same time, we are putting all our capacities in addressing the humanitarian consequences and putting all our capacities to try to help, especially developing countries, overcome the huge challenges they are facing, and at the same time responding to what it is a basic need for the Ukraine. And the basic need for the Ukraine is, of course, to be able to export their grains.
Thank you, Secretary General. You've been raising consistently the concern about the food security crisis due to the ongoing war that we're seeing as well. And as you rightfully mentioned, the African continent has suffered unfairly, even with vaccine distribution. So it seems like the countries still don't seem to learn from previous mistakes. So what would be your direct message to the leadership of other countries to address the food crisis in the African continent right now?
Well, I think many countries have reserves. They should put those reserves at the disposal of the countries that are more in need. Some countries have export bans. They should remove those export bans. And at the same time, for many countries, the problem is not access to food, is resources to be able to buy it at the level of prices that we have. And so all the questions related to the different instruments that the IMF and the World Bank have need to be boosted in debt relief, in providing liquidity, and allowing developing countries that are strangled financially at the present moment to be able to acquire the foodstuffs and the energy they need to maintain the minimum, the bare conditions that their populations need. If not, we risk to have a famine that the world has not known for several decades now.
You know, you have been in a unique position with the history of work that you've done. You've worked closely representing your country, you've worked in politics, and now currently you are, helming diplomacy. Do you believe currently where you stand that geopolitics is killing global governance?
Well, we cannot destroy what barely exists. Let's be clear. There was never a true global governance system, and much less a democratic one. We have, of course, a set of multilateral institutions, but the truth is that many have no teeth. Look at the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization. They have not the capacity even to investigate seriously the origins of COVID, and they have not the capacity to obtain information from everybody that is vital to organize a global response. And their proposals, their initiatives on vaccines, on treatments, etc., had to fight an enormous explosion of egoism that we have witnessed in the world. And those institutions that have this have little appetite to bite. The Security Council has this. But with the veto systems, the truth is that there are many situations, especially the most important situations, in which the Security Council is paralyzed. So the global governance system was not exactly working properly. And so I think we need to take profit of this occasion exactly to make people understand that we need global governance mechanisms, that there are global public goods that need to be managed with global governance mechanisms. And that is the objective of our Common Agenda initiative that was taken at the request of the members of the General Assembly last year, and in which there was a first round of consultations. We have an high-level panel led by the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister of Sweden and the former President of Liberia, exactly to look into what are the global public goods that have problems in the way the global interest is taken into account, and how can we adapt our institutions in order to be able to deliver in relation to that global governance. Which means we need to transform this dramatic crisis into an opportunity to make people understand that what we had was not enough, that what we had was not working, and we need to seriously think about the reform of international coordination mechanisms. We must give them effective capacity of governance, at least in those areas that are critical, namely when we deal with climate, namely when we deal with pandemics that apparently nobody is able to control, and also that we can have a new agenda for peace, able to deal with a number of serious problems that we are facing, when we have seen it with the war in Ukraine. But also, I mean, we need to put order in the chaos of the cyberspace. We need to look into the outer space, which again, there is a situation of chaos developing. So there is time for us. The war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion has demonstrated that the mechanisms of governance we had are clearly not enough. And we need to seriously put on the table the reforms that are needed. It will not be easy. The geopolitical divides will make it complicated. I'm fully aware of that, but it's our duty to do everything, at least to tell the truth, and then to use the truth to make the changes, or try to make the changes that are necessary.
Speaking of telling the truth, when you currently look at the failing decline of democratic institutions, the concerning decline of just democracy and where it stands on a global level, what are the few alarming signs that you are particularly concerned by, that you think more people should be talking about?
I think there are two very worrying trends. One is the increase of authoritarianism in many parts of the world. The idea of the strong man, normally not strong women, strong men. The reduction of space for the civil society, the dramatic problems faced by journalists in several countries around the world, where they risk to go to jail. Sometimes they put their lives at risk. So this is one set of problems. And then we have the difficulties that democracies are facing at the present moment to deal, namely, with technological evolution, to deal with all the changes in social relations for which many times our democratic institutions are not entirely prepared. Look at the role of social media and the way misinformation is today permanently used with much stronger capacity than in the past. Look into how irrationality has been emerging. I mean, I am European, even if my function today is universal, but I'm proud of the Enlightenment, the contribution of Europe to global civilization. Now those values of the Enlightenment are put into question. Irrationality in xenophobia, in racism, irrationality in the hatred for the foreigner, the hatred for the migrant, the hatred for the refugee, but also the polarization of societies. I mean, the space of social media fragmented. The people in one side of the spectrum only dealing with other people in that side of the spectrum, and the same with the second side, with societies more and more divided. So we need to fight authoritarianism, but we need at the same time to look seriously how we can improve, how we can reform our democratic institutions to be able to cope with the challenges of the present times.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. I want to take a question from someone from the Paris Peace Forum community that we have joining us, Salih Booker, the Senior Program Officer of International Programs at the Ford Foundation. And over to you, Salih, for the question.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your leadership in attempting to design a global common agenda. This question is about inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated deep structural inequality, and it has exacerbated inequality worldwide. In your recent remarks at the Least Developed Countries Conference, you warned against a two-tiered recovery from COVID-19, and you identified a morally bankrupt global financial system designed by the rich and powerful to benefit the rich and powerful as a major structural driver of global economic inequality. What then are the next steps in global governance terms necessary to end the pandemic equitably and to urgently address the looming debt crisis of poor countries? Because at this time, when greater international cooperation is needed, more countries are turning inward. So what are the incentives for the wealthiest countries to acknowledge and participate in dismantling this unequal structural world order that increasingly resembles a kind of global apartheid? Thank you.
Well, there are many examples of solidarity, and solidarity is a value that is fundamental from my perspective of the world. But I think if we count only on solidarity, we'll probably be doomed because egoism is also there. So we need people to understand in an enlightened way what their self-interest is. And developed countries are now themselves facing the consequences of inequality. I mean, this pandemic was not eradicated as it could have been if vaccines on time would have been given to everybody everywhere. That would, of course, limit the creation of new variants. And we are at the risk of the situation in which, at the end of this year, all the vaccines that we have received and distributed in the developed world will probably become not relevant anymore, which means that the inequality that was imposed in the vaccine distribution system is now creating a major threat for developed countries in the future. Then the inequality that we have seen in relation to the resources available for countries in the developing world is now feeding unrest. We have seen recently Sri Lanka, Pakistan. We have seen coup d'etats in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and this is creating an environment in which there will be massive migration, an environment in which there will be conflicts emerging, and conflicts now are coming to the center of the developed world. So, I mean, this egoism has proven to be a kind of a suicidal approach. And then one other thing that is obvious, when one looks at climate change, now climate change is not only a problem for developing countries. We see dramatic consequences in public health. We see dramatic consequences in infrastructure in developed countries themselves. So the inequality that was embedded in our system from the beginning, it's not something created recently, it was embedded in the system. Many people would say 10, 20 years ago that inequality is a factor of development. We need to concentrate resources to have investment, and that is what will allow for progress. No? So inequality was part of the way the system was designed. Now inequality became an obstacle for the system to work. And so we need to do reforms. We need to do reforms in relation to the international financial institutions. It's unacceptable, the role that is played today by credit rating agencies with a very biased approach that totally undermines the situation of developing countries. We need to make sure that the financial institutions that exist correspond to what the world is today and not what the world was after the Second World War. But at the same time, we need to take profit of what exists now. I mean, special drawing rights were distributed, but they were distributed proportionally to the quotas. They must be redistributed based on needs. And unfortunately, the redistribution until now is very small. Everybody thought that debt relief was important, but we had the suspension just for least developed countries, and it was a suspension, and the so-called framework for debt relief did not work. It was so complicated, so bureaucratic, and so limited. Only 3 countries became candidates, and there was no debt relief available, especially for middle-income countries. And look at the small island developing states. They are middle-income countries. They are under the pressure of the COVID. They are under the pressure of climate change. Tourism has evaporated in many of them. And they are in a dramatic situation, but as they are middle-income country, they don't need to have concessional financial support. So we need to rethink all these mechanisms. We need to make them work in providing liquidity in a much more fair way and in addressing debt relief in a much more serious way. And we have the instruments to do that. So we need a basic reform of the global financial system, but we cannot wait for that. The dramatic situation in developing countries is such that we need to use the instruments that now exist to put them to work quickly and to boost their capacity, oriented them to those that are more in risk of a collapse that would, in the end, undermine our global order.
Thank you, Secretary General, and thank you, Salih, for your question. I now want to introduce Fatmé Masri, who's the Project Director of Arab Reform Initiative. Fatmé, over to you for your question, please.
Thank you. As a Think and Do tank, our key mission is to articulate a homegrown agenda for democratic change and social justice in Arab countries. One of our key work pillars is on women's political participation in the MENA region, to enable an inclusive women-owned approach and vision for what a feminist peace looks like in conflict-affected countries. We do this through providing a leading platform for perspectives and voices of Arab women who don't usually have access to policymakers, and an emerging network of activists, researchers, and policymakers rethinking women political participation by making sure that it is inclusive. A myriad of female activists we engage with from the MENA region proclaim they're not meaningfully included and represented in negotiations and mediation political efforts. My question to you, Secretary General, is twofold. How can we progress from symbolic and quantitative women's inclusion in high-level peace processes to achieve well-founded feminist policies with meaningful impact? And how will the UN ensure adequate resources towards such efforts in light of changing global priorities as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Well, let's be clear. This is a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. And so the central question is how to change power relations. And to change power relations, I think women must take them. I mean, power is never given, it is taken. And we need to use your allies in my side of the world in order to make sure that we work together to really change power relations effectively. Now, what we did here in the UN, the first thing I did was to make sure that we had parity, full parity at decision-making level. We have 190 senior leaders in the UN. Now we have full parity. More than 50 women, by the way, than men. We had less than 1/3 just 5 years ago. And the same battle needs to exist in all governments, in all parliaments, in all boards of all companies. And this question of power needs to be on the center of everything we do. And obviously, one thing that is essential is in relation to the peace and security architecture. If there is something where these power relations are more against women, is in the peace and security architecture. I mean, military institutions, the concept of war, everything else, I mean, is the product of a male-dominated world. And so it has been very difficult to have women playing an important role on that. I'm proud that now we have also not only parity at the level of higher decision-making level in the UN, but we managed to have parity in the heads of the missions and the deputy heads of the missions, which means we have a woman in charge of our mission in Afghanistan. We have a woman in charge of our mission in Iraq. We have a woman in charge of our mission in Central African Republic. We have a woman in charge of our mission in the DRC. So we need to push for women to play a decisive role in peace missions and to push for women to be represented in mediation efforts. And that, I must tell you, is a very tough thing. When I try to convince the Libyans to sit together, men delegations come, and we need to force them to have women delegations. I remember in negotiations of Yemen, long time ago in Stockholm, no women were there. So we need to bring women through civil society consultations. So this is still a very tough situation, and we need to fight it with all our forces. And when one looks at the war in Ukraine, one thing I'm absolutely sure, if we had women taking decisions, key decisions, I don't think we would have had the war in Ukraine. I don't think we have had the Russian invasion.
Off, I just want to give you the final word with this question that I'm going to throw at you. Something that you said recently in an interview really struck me when you said that the war will not end in meetings, it will end when the Russian Federation decides to end it. So to the people listening, what is the role of we the people when it comes to ending this war, re-establishing order of peace? What would your final send-off message be to the people listening to you?
I think we need to do everything possible for the war to end. I need to go on insisting with the need for the war to end, for troops to go back to their barracks. But as the war goes on raging, we need to do everything possible to uphold international humanitarian law, to make sure humanitarian work works, to create the conditions to minimize its impact in the most poor around the world, and at the same time to create mechanisms of accountability. I think that the strength of mechanisms of accountability is the best way to prevent future wars like this one.
Thank you so much. And thank you for continuing to lead with moral fortitude and courage to speak the truth during these times of grave crisis. We look forward to your continued leadership. Thank you so much, Secretary General, for your time.
It was a pleasure to participate, and I wish you all the success in the Peace Forum.
Thank you so much, Secretary General.